Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more philosophy. Today we are diving back into the works of Georg Hegel. This is The Science of Logic. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but some people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the science of logic with part 2. What is the name of it? Quantum. Quantum, part 2, B, extensive and intensive quantum. A, their difference. 1. We have seen that quantum has its determinateness as limit in amount. In itself, quantum is discrete, a plurality which does not have a being different from its limit or its limit outside it. Quantum, thus, with its limit, which as limit is a plurality, is extensive magnitude. Extensive magnitude is to be distinguished from continuous magnitude. Its direct opposite is not the discrete, but the intensive magnitude. Extensive and intensive magnitudes are determinacies of the quantitative limit itself, whereas quantum is identical with its limit. Continuous and discrete magnitudes are, on the contrary, determinations of magnitude in itself, that is, of quantity as such, insofar as in quantum abstraction is made from the limit. Extensive magnitude has the moment of continuity in it and in its limit. For its many is everywhere continuous. The limit as negation appears, therefore, in this equality of the many as a limiting of the unity. Continuous magnitude is quantity that continues without regard to any limit, and insofar as it is represented without one such limit, the latter is a limitation in general, without discreteness being posited in it. Determined as only continuous magnitude, quantum is not yet determined for itself because the magnitude lacks the one, in which the determinateness for itself lies, and number. Similarly, a discrete magnitude is immediately only a differentiated many in general, which, if it were to have a limit as a many, would be only an aggregate, that is, would only be indeterminately limited. In order for quantum to be determinate, the many must be concentrated into one, and thereby be posited as identical with the limit. Continuous and discrete magnitude, taken as quantum in general, have each posited in it only one side, one of the two sides, by virtue of which quantum is fully determined in a number. Taken immediately, this latter is extensive quantum, the symbol determinateness, which is amount essentially, but the amount of one and the same unit. Extensive quantum is distinguished from number only because the latter the determinateness is explicitly posited as plurality. 2. However, the determinateness through number, how much there is of something, does not require being distinguished from how much there is of something else, as if to the determinateness of one thing belonged how much there is of it and how much there is of an other. For the determinateness of magnitude as such is a limit determined for itself. indifferent, and simply self-referring. And in number, this limit is posited as enclosed within the one existing for itself. The externality that it has, the reference to other, is inside it. Further, like the many in general, this many of the limit is not internally unequal but continuous. Each many is what any other many is. Consequently, the many as a many of existence, outside one another, or as discrete, does not constitute the determinateness as such. Thus, this many collapses for itself into its continuity and becomes a simple unity. Amount is but a moment of number, but as an aggregate of numerical wants, it does not constitute the determinateness of number. On the contrary, these wants, as indifferent and self-external, are sublated in number whose being has turned back into itself. The externality that constituted the wants of plurality vanishes in the one as the self-reference of number. The limit of quantum, which, as extensive, had its existent determinateness as self-external number, thus passes over into simple determinateness. In this simple determination of limit, quantum is intensive magnitude. And the limit, or the determinateness, which is identical with quantum, is now also posited as simple. It is degree. Degree is thus a determinate magnitude, a quantum, but at the same time it is not an aggregate of several within itself. It is only a plurality. Plurality is a severality that has gathered together into simple determination. It is existence that has returned into being for itself. It is true that its determinateness must be expressed by a number, which is the being of a quantum, as completely determined. But the number is not an amount or a how many times, but is rather a one-fold, only a degree. When we speak of 10 or 20 degrees, the quantum which has that many degrees, the 10th, the 20th degree, is not the amount and sum of the degrees. If that were the case, it would be an extensive quantum. It is, rather, only that one degree, the 10th, the 20th. It does contain the determinateness found in the number 10 or 20, but not as several ones. The number is there as a sublated amount, as a simple determinateness. 3. In number, quantum is posited in its complete determinateness, but as intensive quantum in the being for itself of number. It is posited as it is according to its concept or implicitly in itself. For the form of self-reference which it has in degree is, at the same time, the externality of degree to itself. As extensive quantum, number is a numerical plurality and thus has externality inside it. This externality, as plurality in general, collapses into a state of undifferentiatedness and is sublated into the numerical one, the self-reference of number. But quantum has its determinateness as number. It contains this determinateness, as we have said, whether the latter is posited in it or not. Degree, therefore, which as internally simple no longer has this other external otherness in it, has it outside it, and refers to it as its determinateness. A plurality external to it constitutes the determinateness of the simple limit which the degree is for itself. Insofar as in the extensive quantum, amount was supposed to be found within the number, it was sublated there. Now, as thus sublated, amount is posited outside number. Number, in being posited as a 1, as self-reference, reflected into itself, excludes from itself the indifference and the externality of amount, and is self-reference as reference to an external through itself. In this, quantum has the reality which is adequate to its concept. The indifference of the determinate-ness constitutes its quality, that is, a determinate-ness which is in it as a determinate-ness external to itself. Accordingly, degree is a unitary quantitative determinateness among a plurality of such intensities which, though diverse, each being only a simple reference to itself, are at the same time in essential connection with each other, so that each has its determinateness in this continuity with the others. This reference, connecting a degree through itself to its other, makes ascent and descent on the scale of degrees a continuous progress, a flow, which is an uninterrupted and indivisible alteration. None of the more or less differentiated within it is separate from the others, but each has its determinateness only in these others. As a self-referring quantitative determination, each degree is indifferent towards the others, but in itself it equally refers to this externality. It is what it is only through the intermediary of this externality. In short, its reference to itself is not an indifferent reference to externality, but in this externality it possesses its quality. B. Identity of extensive and intensive magnitude. Degree is not inherently external to itself. It is not, however, the indeterminate one. It is not the principle of number as such, which is not amount except negatively, that is, only in the sense of not being an amount. Intensive magnitude is at first a simple one of many, more or less. There are several degrees, but they are not determined either as a unitary one or as a more or less, but only as referring to each other as outside each other, or in the identity of the one and the more or less than. Thus, although these several more or less are, as such, indeed, outside the unitary degree, the determinateness of the latter lies nonetheless in its connection with them. The degree thus contains amount. Just as 20 contains an extensive magnitude, 20 ones as discrete, the specific degree contains them as continuity, a continuity which simply is this determinate plurality. It is the 20th degree, and it is this 20th degree only through the intermediate of this amount which, as such, is outside of it. The determinateness of the intensive magnitude is to be considered, therefore, from two sides. It is determined through other intensive quanta and is continuous with its otherness, so that its determinateness consists in this connection with it. Now, insofar as this determinateness is, first, a simple determinateness, it is determined as against the other degrees. It excludes them from itself and has its determinateness in this exclusion. But, second, it is determined within. This it is in the amount as its amount, not in the amount as excluded, or not in the amount of the other degrees. The 20th degree contains the 20 within itself. It is not only determined as distinguished from the 19th, the 21st, etc., but its determinateness is rather its amount. But inasmuch as the amount is its own, the determinateness is at the same time, essentially, as amount, the degree is extensive quantum. Extensive and intensive magnitude are, therefore, one and the same determinateness of quantum. They are distinguished only inasmuch as the one has the amount within and the other has the same without. Extensive magnitude passes over into intensive magnitude because its many collapses in and for itself into oneness and steps outside it. But, conversely, this simple one has its determinateness only in the amount, its amount, indifferent to the otherwise determined intensities. It has the externality of amount in it, thus intensive magnitude is just as essentially extensive magnitude. With this identity, the qualitative something comes on the scene, for the identity is the unity that refers back to itself through the negation of its distinct terms. These terms, however, make up the determinateness of the existent magnitude. The something is a quantum, but its qualitative existence is now posited as indifferent to it as it is in itself. One can speak of quantum, number, as such, etc., without any mention of something as their substrate. But the something, self-mediated by virtue of the negation of its determinations, now confronts these as existing for itself, and since it has a quantum, it confronts them as something which has an extensive and intensive quantum. Its one determinateness, which it has as quantum, is posited in the distinct moments of unity and amount. It is in itself not only one and the same determinateness, but the positing of it in these differences as extensive and intensive quantum is a return into this unity, which, as negative, is the something posited as indifferent to them. Remark 1. As normally depicted in ordinary usage, extensive and intensive quantum are distinguished as kinds of magnitudes, as if there were some objects with only intensive and others with only extensive magnitude. But there is now a philosophical science of nature in which plurality, the extensive, as for instance in connection with the fundamental property of nature to fill space, and in other instances as well, is converted into something intensive, in the sense that intensity, as dynamism, is the true determination. Density, for instance, or the specific filling of space, must be understood as being essentially not a certain aggregate and amount of material parts in the quantum of space, but a certain degree of the force of the matter filling space. There are two kinds of determinations to be distinguished in this context. Two concepts are at play in this conversion, as it has been called, of the mechanical into the dynamic way of looking at things. The concept of self-subsisting parts that subsist outside one another, and are only externally bound together into a whole, and, different from this, the concept of force. What is viewed on the one side as only an aggregate of mutually external atoms is considered on the other side as the expression of the fundamental simple force. Now, these relations of whole and parts, of force and its expression, that come up for contrast here, do not belong in this place. They will be considered later on. This much, however, can be pointed out right away, namely, that although the relation of force and its expression that corresponds to the intensiveness of magnitude is indeed vis-a-vis the relation of whole and parts. The truer one, force, is for that reason no less one-sided than intensiveness. And the expression, the externality of extensiveness, is just as inseparable from force, so that one and the same content is equally present in the two forms of intensive and extensive magnitude. The other determinateness that comes up here is the quantitative as such, which, as extensive quantum, is sublated and transformed into degree, the supposedly true determination. But it has been shown that degree contains the form of determinateness as well, so that the one form is essential to the other. Consequently, every existence exhibits its quantitative determination no less as an extensive than as an intensive quantum. Everything, to the extent that it appears in quantitative determination, therefore serves as an example of this. Even number necessarily has this double form immediately in it. It is an amount, and therefore extensive magnitude, but number is also a 1, a 10, a 100, and to this extent it marks the transition to intensive magnitude. For in this unity the manifold collapses into the simple. In itself, the one is extensive magnitude. It can be represented as an arbitrary amount of parts. Thus, the 10th, the 100th, is this simple, intensive magnitude that has its determinateness in the more or less than 100th lying outside it, that is, in the extensive magnitude. Number is a 10, a 100, and at the same time, the 10th, the 100th, in the system of numbers, both are the same determinateness. In the circle, the unit is called a degree because every part of the circle has its determinateness essentially in the many more outside it. It is determined as a unit of only a fixed amount of these units. As a mere spatial magnitude, the degree of the circle is only an ordinary number considered as degree. It is an intensive magnitude that has meaning only as determined through the amount of the degrees into which the circle is divided, just as number derives its meaning only in the number series. The magnitude of a concrete object displays its two sides as extensive and intensive in the double determinations of its existence, appearing in one as something external and in the other as something internal. Thus, for instance, a mass is, as weight, an extensive magnitude inasmuch as it constitutes an amount of pounds, hundredweights, etc., but it is an intensive magnitude as it exerts a certain pressure. The magnitude of the pressure is a simple magnitude, a degree, as determined in a scale of degrees of pressure. As exerting pressure, the mass appears as a being in itself, a subject, to which there accrues a distinctive intensive magnitude. Conversely, that which exerts this degree of pressure has the capacity of displacing a certain amount of pounds, etc., and its magnitude is measured accordingly. Or again, heat has a degree. This degree, whether to the 10th, the 20th, etc., is a simple sensation, something subjective. But this degree is equally present as extensive magnitude in the form of the expansion of some fluid matter, of mercury in the thermometer, of air, sound, etc. A higher degree of temperature finds expression in a longer mercury column, or in a narrower clay cylinder. It warms up a larger space in the same way as a lower degree warms up a smaller. The higher a tone, the more intensive it is, and the greater is at the same time the number of its vibrations. Or a louder tone, to which a higher degree of intensity is attributed, is audible in a larger space. With a more intensive color, a larger surface can be colored in the same way as with a weaker one. Or, again, something brighter, another kind of intensity, is visible at a greater distance than something not as bright, etc. Similarly, in things spiritual, a high intensity of character, talent, genius, has a comparably encompassing presence, far-reaching effect, and an all-pervading influence. The most profound concept has the most universal significance and application. Remark 2. Kant has made peculiar use of the determinateness of intensive quantum by applying to it, too, a metaphysical determination of the soul. In his critique of the metaphysical propositions concerning the soul, which he calls the paralogisms of reason, he comes to a consideration of the syllogistic inference from the simplicity of the soul to its permanence. To this inference he objects that even if we hold to the soul this simple nature, namely that it contains no manifold parts outside one another, and hence no extensive magnitude, one nevertheless cannot deny to it, any more than to any other existing thing, intensive magnitude, that is, a degree of reality in regard to all its faculties, indeed, to everything in general that constitutes its existence, which might diminish by infinitely many smaller degrees, and thus the alleged substance could be transformed into nothing, although not by disintegration, but by a gradual remission of its powers, for even consciousness always has a degree, which can always be diminished. Consequently, so does the faculty of being conscious of itself, and likewise with all other faculties. In rational psychology, such as was this abstract metaphysics, the soul was considered not as spirit, but as an immediate existent, as a sole thing. Kant is therefore justified in applying to it the category of quantum, just as to any other existing thing, and inasmuch as this existent is determined as simple, that of intensive quantum. Being does indeed belong to spirit, but of an intensity entirely different from that of intensive quantum. It is an intensity, rather, in which the form of merely immediate being and all its categories are sublated. It should not have been just a matter of agreeing to the removal of the category of extensive quantum, but of removing quantum as such. The next step was to recognize how, in the eternal nature of spirit, there is existence, consciousness, and finitude. How they proceed from it without spirit thereby becoming a thing. C. Alteration of quantum. Sorry. The difference between extensive and intensive quantum is indifferent to the determinateness of quantum as quantum. But quantum is in general determinateness posited as sublated. The indifferent limit, the determinateness, which is just as much the negation of itself. In extensive quantum, this difference is developed, but intensive magnitude is the existence of this externality, which is quantum is in itself. The difference is posited as the contradiction which it is in itself, of being a simple, self-referring determinateness, which is the negation of itself, of having its determinateness not in it, but in another quantum. A quantum, according to its quality, is therefore in absolute continuity with its externality, with its otherness. Consequently, not only can every determinateness of magnitude be transcended, not only can it be altered, that it must alter is now posited. The determination of magnitude continues into its otherness in such a way that it has its being only in this continuity with an other. It is not just a limit that exists, but one that becomes. The one is infinite, or self-referring negation, and hence the repulsion of itself from itself. Quantum is equally infinite, posited as the self-referring negation. It repels itself from itself. But it is a determinate one, the one which has passed over into existence and limit. Thus, the repulsion of determinateness from itself, not the generation of something that is like itself, as the repulsion of the one, but of its otherness. Quantum is now posited in it as sending itself beyond itself. It consists in this, that it increases or decreases. It is within it the externality of determinateness. Thus, quantum sends itself beyond itself. This other which it becomes is at first itself a quantum, but a quantum which is not the static limit, but one that impels itself beyond itself. The limit which arises in this beyond is, therefore, only one that again sublates itself and sends itself to a further limit, and so on to infinity. C. Quantitative infinity. A. Its concept. Quantum alters and becomes another quantum. The further determination of this alteration, that it goes on to infinity, lies in that it is positioned as inherently self-contradictory. Quantum becomes an other, but it continues in its otherness, and the other is therefore also a quantum. This latter, however, is not the other, not of a quantum, but of the quantum as such, the negative of itself as a limited something, and hence its own unlimitedness, infinity. Quantum is an ought. It implies that it be determined for itself, and this being determined for itself is rather the being determined in another, and conversely, it is the being determined in another, as sublated, is indifferent subsisting for itself. In this way, finitude and infinity, each at once, acquires within it a double, though opposite meaning. Quantum is finite, first, as limited in general, second, as sending itself beyond itself, as being determined in another. On the other hand, its infinity is, first, the unlimitedness of quantum, second, its being turned back into itself, the indifferent being for itself. If we now compare these moments with each other, we find that the determination of quantum's finitude, its sending itself beyond itself into another that constitutes its determination, is equally the determination of the infinite. The negation of limit is this same transcendence of determinateness, so that in this negation, in the infinite, quantum has its final determinateness. The other moment of infinity is the for itself, which is indifferent to the limit, but the quantum itself is so limited as to be indifferent with respect to its limit, and hence with respect to other quanta and its beyond. In quantum, finitude and infinity, the latter supposedly separate from finitude as bad infinity, each already possesses within it the moment of the other. The qualitative and quantitative infinite are distinguished inasmuch as in the former the opposition of the finite and the infinite is qualitative, and the transition of the finite into the infinite, or the reference of each to the other, is present only in the in itself, in their concept. Qualitative determinateness is immediate. It refers to otherness, essentially, as to a being which is other than it. It is not posited as having its negation, its other in it. By contrast, magnitude is, as such, sublated determinateness. It is posited as being unlike and indifferent to itself, and hence as something alterable. The qualitative finite and infinite, therefore, stand opposed to each other absolutely, that is, abstractly. Their unity is the interconnection underlying them. Hence, the finite continues in its other only in itself, not in it. By contrast, in the infinite, in which the quantitative finite has its absolute determinateness, this finite refers to itself in it. This, their mutual reference, is first displayed in the quantitatively infinite process. B. The quantitative infinite process. The process to infinity is in general the expression of contradiction. Here, of the contradiction contained in the quantitative finite, or in the quantum in general. It is the reciprocal determination of the finite and the infinite that came up for consideration in the sphere of the qualitative, with the difference that, as just indicated in the sphere of quantity, the limit inherently sends itself beyond itself and continues there, and hence, conversely, the quantitative infinite is also posited as having the quantum in it. For, in its externality, quantum is itself. Its externality belongs to its determination. The infinite progress is now the expression of this contradiction, not the resolution of it. However, because of the continuity of one determinateness in the other, the progress gives rise to the semblance of a resolution in a union of the two. As at first posited, such a progress is the task of attaining the infinite, but not the attainment of it. It is a perpetual generation of the infinite. Without the progress of ever getting beyond the quantum itself, and without the infinite ever becoming something which is positively present. It belongs to the concept of quantum to have a beyond of itself. This beyond is, first, the abstract moment of the non-being of quantum. This resolves itself in it, and it thus refers to its beyond as to its infinity in accordance with the qualitative moment of the opposition. But, second, quantum is continuous with this beyond. It consists precisely in being the other of itself, external to itself. This externality equally is, therefore, no more an other than the quantum. The beyond, or the infinite, is thus itself a quantum. The beyond is thus recalled from its flight, and the infinite is attained. But because the infinite now become a this side is again a quantum, what is posited is again only a new limit. This limit, as quantum, has also fled again from itself, and as such beyond itself, and has repelled itself from itself into its non-being, into its beyond. And as the quantum repels itself into the beyond, so does the beyond perpetually become a quantum. The continuity of quantum with its other brings about the conjunction of the two in the expression of an infinitely great or infinitely small. Since they both still have in them the determination of quantum, they remain alterable. and the absolute determinateness, which would be a being for itself, is thus not attained. This being outside itself of the determination is posited in the double infinity, posited in the relative opposition of the more and the less, of the infinitely great and the infinitely small. In each, the quantum is maintained in perpetual opposition to its beyond. No matter how much the great is enlarged, it shrinks to insignificance, since it refers to the infinite as to its non-being. The opposition is qualitative. The enlarged quantum has gained nothing, therefore, from the infinite. The latter is its nothing now, just as before. Or again, the increase in the quantum is not an approximation to the infinite, for the distinction between the quantum and its infinity essentially has also the moment of being non-quantitative. This moment is only the sharpened expression of the contradiction that the quantum ought to be something great, that is, a quantum, and non-finite, that is, not a quantum. Equally, the infinitely small is, as something small, a quantum, and therefore remains absolutely, that is, qualitatively, too great for the infinite and opposed to it. In both, there remains the contradiction of the infinite progress, which in them should have reached its goal. This infinity, which persists in the determination of the beyond of the finite, is to be characterized as the bad quantitative infinity. Like the qualitatively bad infinity, it is the perpetual movement back and forth from one side of the persistent contradiction to the other, from the limit to its non-being, and from the latter back again to the other, the limit. To be sure, the term to which the advance is made in the quantitative progress is not an abstract other in general, but a quantum which is explicitly posited as different. But this quantum remains opposed to its negation in the same way. Also, the progress, therefore, is neither an advance nor a gain, but rather a repetition of one and the same move, a positing, a sublating, and then again a positing and a sublating, an impotence of the negative to which it sublates continuously comes back by its very sublation of it. The two, the positing and the sublation, are so bonded to each other that they absolutely flee from each other, and yet, in thus fleeing, they are unable to part, but rather become bonded in their very flight from each other. Remark 1. The bad infinity, especially in the form of the quantitative progress to infinity, this uninterrupted flitting over limits which it is powerless to sublate, and the perpetual falling back into them, is commonly held to be something sublime and a kind of divine service, just as in philosophy it has been regarded as ultimate. This progress has often been exploited in tirades which have been admired as sublime productions. In fact, however, this modern sublimity does not enhance the object, which rather takes flight from it, but bloats the subject who ingests such vast quantities. The poverty of such an irreducibly subjective step-by-step elevation on the ladder of the quantitative is betrayed by the admission that in vain labor there is no getting closer to the infinite goal, for the attainment of which, to be sure, quite another line of attack is required. Here are examples of tirades of the kind which make manifest what this elevation ultimately amounts to. Kant, for example, at the conclusion of Critique of Practical Reason, deems it as sublime. When the subject rises in thought above the place it occupies in the world of the senses, and extends its reach into an unbounded magnitude of worlds beyond worlds, and systems of systems, and into the limitless times of their periodic motion, their beginning and their continuance. Imagination fails before this progression into the immeasurably distant, where, beyond the most distant world, there lies a still more distant one. Behind the past, however far back traced, a still more distant past. Ahead of the future, however far down projected, yet another future. Thought fails before this representation of the immeasurable, just as in a dream, in which one relentlessly goes on and on down a long corridor without seeing the end of it, and finishes with falling or fainting. This account, besides capturing all that there is into this quantitative elevation in a wealth of pictorial imagery, deserves praise mainly because of how truthfully it betrays the end result of this elevation. Thought succumbs. The upshot is falling and giddiness. What causes thought to succumb, what produces the falling and the giddiness, is nothing else but the boredom of this repetition that makes a limit disappear, come up again, and again disappear, and so lets the rising and perishing of the one for the other, and of the one into the other, of here into the there, and the there into the here, perpetuate itself, only conveying the feeling of the impotence of this infinite, this ought, which would want to be a master of the finite, but cannot. Also, Haller's description of eternity, which Kant called horrifying, is commonly the object of special admiration, but often for what is precisely not the reason that constitutes its true merit. I heap up giant numbers, pile millions upon millions, eon upon eon, and world upon world. And when I am on that endless march, and dizzy on that terrifying height, I seek you again. The power of numbers, though multiplied 1,000-fold, is still not even a fraction of you. I blot them out, and there you are, complete, before me. In stressing the value of this heaping and piling of numbers and worlds as a description of eternity, what is overlooked is that the poet himself declares this so-called terrifying venture into the beyond as futile and hollow, and he concludes that only by giving up this empty, infinite progress will the true infinite itself become present to him. There have been astronomers who like to flatter themselves about the sublimity of their science on the ground that it deals with an immeasurable multitude of stars with immeasurable spaces and times within which the already vast distances and periods that serve as their units, even when taken many times over, shrink to insignificance. The shallow astonishment to which they surrender themselves, their fatuous hopes of eventually traveling in another life from star to star, and in that immensity to make discoveries of always the same kind of things. This they adduce as the main point of excellence in their science, a science which is worthy of admiration, rather, not because of such quantitative infinitude, but to the contrary, because of the relations of measure and the laws which reason recognizes in these objects, and which, in contrast to that other irrational infinitude, constitute the rational infinite. To the infinity connected with the external intuition of the senses, Kant opposes the other infinity, the one which the individual attains when he returns to the invisible I, and to all the terrors of fate and tyranny he opposes with absolute freedom of his will, of a pure I. When, starting with his immediate surroundings, he lets them vanish in his sight, and even what appears enduring, the world, worlds upon worlds, he lets collapse into ruins until, alone, he recognizes himself as equal to himself. The I in this solitude is indeed the attained beyond. It has come to itself, is at home with itself, right here. The absolute negativity, which in the progression beyond the quantum of the senses was only in flight, is brought in pure self-consciousness to affirmation and presence. But this pure I, when held fixed in abstraction and empty of content, as existence in general, the fullness of the natural and spiritual universe as a beyond confronting it. The same contradiction reasserts itself that lies at the heart of the infinite progress, namely, of a being bent upon itself, which is at the same time outside itself, which refers to its other as its non-being, and in this referring remains a longing. For the I has fixed itself on the one side, with its indigent and insufferable emptiness before it, and on the other side, with a fullness which, in being negated, is still present as its beyond. Kant accompanies the mention of these two sublimes with the remark that wonder for the first the external and reverence for the second the inner do indeed excite research, but cannot substitute for their deficiency. Thus, he declares those exaltations as being unsatisfying for reason cannot stop at them and at the feelings associated with them, nor can it let the beyond and the void be accepted as ultimate. But it is above all in its application to morality that the infinite progression has been taken as an ultimate. The second opposition, just cited, of finite and infinite in the shape of the manifold world and the I raised to its freedom, is at first qualitative. As it determines itself, the I at the same time determines nature and frees itself from it. It thereby refers itself to its other through itself, refers to another which, as external existence, is a manifold and also something quantitative. The reference to the quantitative becomes itself quantitative. The negative reference to the I, to it, its power over the not I, over the senses and external nature, is consequently so represented that morality can and ought ever to enlarge, while the power of the senses ought ever to recede. The perfect adequacy of the will to the moral law, however, is transposed to the unending progress to infinity. That is represented as an absolutely unattainable beyond, and precisely this, that it is unattainable, is supposed to be the source of true reliance and just consolation. For morality ought to be a struggle, but this it cannot be except on the assumption that the will is disproportionate to the law, and the law, therefore, becomes for it an irreducible beyond. In this opposition of the I and the not I, or the will and the moral law, and nature and the sensuousness of the will, are presupposed as perfectly self-subsistent and mutually indifferent. The pure will has its own law, which is essentially connected with the senses. Nature and the senses, for their part, have their laws which neither stem from nor are conformable to the will, nor are such that, although diverse from the will, would nevertheless be in essential connection with it, but are, rather, independently determined, finished, and complete in themselves. The two are, nevertheless, both moments of one and the same simple essence, of the I. The will is determined as a negative with respect to nature, so that the will only is to the extent that there is such a thing as a nature, which is diverse from it, and which it sublates, but by which, in sublating it, it is touched and is itself affected. Nature, also as the sensuous element of the human being, is a self-subsistent system of laws indifferent to limitation through an other. It preserves itself while being limited, comes in connection with the will on its own terms, and limits the will of the law just as much as this will limits it. It is by one single act that the will, in determining itself, sublates the otherness of a nature, and this otherness, in being posited with a determinate existence, resists sublatedness and is not sublated. In the infinite progression, the contradiction at work here is not resolved, but, to the contrary, it is displayed as unresolved and unresolvable, and is declared to be such. The conflict of morality and sense is represented as an absolute relation that exists in and for itself. The powerlessness in mastering the qualitative opposition between the finite and the infinite, and in grasping the idea of the true will, which is substantial freedom, this powerlessness takes refuge in magnitude, which it used as a middle link, for magnitude is the qualitative as sublated, the distinction that has become indifferent. But since the two members of the opposition still remain in principle qualitatively different, by behaving as quanta in referring to each other, they are rather each straightway posited as indifferent to this alteration. Nature is determined through the I, the senses through the will of the good. The alteration produced in the senses through the will is only a quantitative distinction, one which leaves them be as they are. In the more abstract exposition of the Kantian philosophy, or at least of its principles, namely in Fische's Wissenschaftliche, the infinite progress, likewise, constitutes the foundation and the ultimate. The first principle in the exposition, I equals I, is followed by a second which is independent of it, the opposition of the not I. The connection between the two is right away also assumed as quantitative distinction, the not I being partly determined through the I, then also partly not. The not I thus continues in it so that it remains opposed to its non-being as something non-sublated. Starting from there, after the contradictions contained therein have been developed in the system, the concluding result is the same relation that made the beginning. The not I remains an infinite shock, an absolute other. Its final reciprocal reference connecting it with the I is the infinite progress, longing and striving, the same contradiction with which the beginning was made. Because the quantitative is determinateness posited as sublated, it was assumed that, by reducing opposition in general to a difference that is only quantitative, much, or rather everything, had been gained for the unity of the absolute, for this one substantiality. That all opposition is only quantitative was for some time a fundamental principle of recent philosophy. The opposed determinations have the same essence, the same content. They are real sides of the opposition because each contains within it both determinations, both factors of the opposition, though it is one factor that predominates on the one side and the other factor on the other side. On the one side, one factor, some matter or activity, is present in greater aggregate or in a stronger degree than in the other. To the extent that different materials or activities are presupposed, the quantitative difference rather confirms and completes their externality and indifference to each other and to their unity. The difference of the absolute unity is supposed to be only quantitative, and, to be sure, the quantitative is the sublated immediate determinateness, but one which is only incompletely negated. It is still the first negation, not the infinite negation, not the negation of negation. Also, being and thought, in being represented as quantitative determinations of the absolute substance, become, as quanta, completely external to each other, without connections, just as it is the case at a lower level for carbon, nitrogen, etc. It is a third, an external reflection, one that abstracts from their difference and recognizes their inner unity, but one that exists only in itself, not equally for itself. In fact, before this unity is represented only as a first immediate unity, or only as a being which, in its quantitative difference, remains equal to itself, but does not posit itself through itself as equal. Consequently, it is not conceptually grasped as the negation of negation, as infinite unity. Only in the qualitative opposition does the posited infinitude, the being for itself, come to the fore, and the quantitative determinateness itself, as we shall presently find out, pass over into the qualitative. Remark 2. It was earlier remarked that the Kantian antinomies display the opposition of the finite and infinite in a more concrete shape applied to a more specific substrate of representation. The antinomy that we were then considering contained the opposition of qualitative finitude and infinitude. In another, the first of the four cosmological antinomies, it is rather the quantitative limit and the conflict associated with it, which is the issue. Here is the place, therefore, to undertake the examination of this antinomy. It concerns the limitation or non-limitation of the world in time and space. The antithesis could just as well be considered with respect to time and space themselves, for whether time and space are relations of things themselves or only forms of intuition, instead makes no difference to the antinomy of limitation or non-limitation in them. A closer analysis of this antinomy will likewise show that both theses, as well as their proofs, which, like those previously considered, are conducted apagogically, amount to nothing more than these two simple opposed claims. There is a limit, and the limit must be transcended. The thesis is: the world has a beginning in time, and in space it is also enclosed within limits. One part of the proof, concerning time, assumes the opposite. For if one assumes that the world has no beginning in time, then up to every given point in time, an eternity has elapsed, and hence an infinite series of states of things in the world, each following another, has passed by. But now the infinity of a series consists precisely in that it can never be completed through a successive synthesis. Therefore, an infinitely elapsed world series is impossible. So a beginning of the world is a necessary condition of its existence, which was to be proved. The other part of the proof, which concerns space, also relies on time. To traverse the parts of spatially infinite world and hold them together would require an infinite time, and this would have to be considered as elapsed if the world is to be viewed in space, not as in becoming, but as completely given. But it was shown in time in the first part of the proof that it is impossible to assume an infinite time as elapsed. But one sees at once that it was unnecessary to make the proof apagogical, or even to conduct it at all, for the proof is itself directly based on the claim which was to be proved. Namely, assumed in some or any given point in time to which an eternity has elapsed. Eternity has only the meager meaning here of bad temporal infinity. Now, a given point in time has no other meaning than that of a determinate limit in time. In the proof, therefore, a limit is presupposed to time which is actual, But that is just what was to be proved. For the thesis is that the world has a beginning in time. There is only this difference, that the assumed limit is a now, which comes at the end of a time just elapsed, whereas the now to be proved is at the beginning of a future time. But this difference is unessential. The now is assumed as the point at which an infinite series of successive states of things is supposed to have flowed away in time, therefore to be an end, a qualitative limit. If this now were considered only as a quantitative limit that flows on and is there, not simply to be surpassed, but as itself self-surpassing, then the infinite time series would not have flowed away in it, but would go on flowing. So the nerve of the proof would fall. On the other hand, if the temporal point is assumed to be the qualitative limit of the past, in which case it is equally the beginning of a future. For each temporal point is in itself the connection of the past and the future. Then the point is also the absolute, that is, abstract beginning of that future. And this is what was to be proved. It is irrelevant that there is already a past preceding its future at this point, for the temporal point is a qualitative limit, and that it is supposed to be taken as qualitative rests on its determination of being completed, elapsed, and therefore not continuing. And so time is interrupted in it. The past is then without connection to a future that could be called such only in respect to it, and therefore without this connection to a future itself only time in general, which has an absolute beginning. But if the future were to stand in connection with the past, as indeed it does, through the now, the given point in time, and in this way were determined as future, then this point of time, also from the other side, would not be a limit. The infinite time series would continue in what was called the future, and would not be, as assumed, completed. The truth is that time is pure quantity. The point which the proof uses, and in which time is supposed to be interrupted, is rather the self-sublating being for itself of the now. All that the proof does is to picture the time limit, which in the thesis is claimed to be absolute, as a given point of time, and straightway to assume it as completed. That is, as an abstract point, a popular determination which, since representation, easily lets pass for a limit, thus allowing as assumption in the proof what earlier had been put forward as the thing to be proved. The antithesis runs: the world has no beginning and no limits in space, but is infinite with regard to both time and space. Here, too, the proof assumes the opposite. For suppose that it has a beginning. Since the beginning is an existence preceded by a time in which the thing was not, there must be an antecedent time in which the world was not, that is, an empty time. But now no arising of any sort of thing is possible in an empty time, because no part of such a time has, in itself, prior to another part, any distinguishing condition of its existence rather than its non-existence. Thus, many series of things may begin in the world, but the world itself cannot have a beginning, and so is infinite with respect to past time. Like the others, this apocalyptical proof contains a direct and unproved assertion of what is supposed to be proved. For it first assumes a beyond of the existent world, an empty time, but it then goes on to continue the existence of this world beyond itself into the empty time, sublates this time thereby, and consequently extends the existence to infinity. The world is an existence. The proof presupposes that this existence arises, and that its arising has an antecedent condition in time. But the antithesis itself is just this, that there is no unconditional existence, no absolute limit, but that the existence of the world always demands an antecedent condition. What was to be proved thus finds itself in the proof as assumption. Further, the condition is then sought in the empty time, and this is as much as saying that it is assumed as temporal and consequently as existence, and as something restricted. The general assumption, therefore, is that the world presupposes as existence another conditioned existence in time, and so on, therefore, to infinity. The proof regarding the infinity of the world in space is the same. The spatial finitude of the world is apagogically positive, for it would then exist in an empty, unlimited space and would stand in relation to it. But such a relation of the world to no object is a nothing. What was supposed to be proved is, here too, directly presupposed in the proof. It is directly assumed that the spatially delimited world is to be found in an empty space, and that it stands in relation to this space. That is, that there must have been a move transcending it. On the one hand, a move into emptiness, into the beyond, and the non-being of the world. But on the other hand, in order that the world remains in relation to that empty space, that is, so that it continues in it, that beyond is to be represented as filled with world-like existence. The infinity of the world in space, which is asserted in the antithesis, is nothing else than, on the one hand, the empty space, and on the other, the relation of the world to it. That is to say, its continuity into space, or the filling of space. And this contradiction, that time is simultaneously empty yet filled, is the infinite progression of determinate existence, the contradiction itself, the relation of the world to empty space, is made the foundation on which the proof rests. The thesis and antithesis and their proofs produce nothing more, therefore, than the opposed claims that a limit is, and that the limit is just as much a sublated one, that the limit has a beyond with which it is however connected, and into which it must pass, but in which there arises, however, another such limit, which is no limit. The solution of these antinomies, as of the previously mentioned, is transcendental. That is, it consists in the assertion of the ideality of space and time as forms of intuition, by which is meant that the world does not contradict itself within, is not something that sublates itself, but that consciousness alone, in its intuition, and in the connection of intuition to understanding and reason, is rather the being which is self-contradictory. It is an excessive tenderness for the world to keep contradiction away from it, to transfer it to spirit instead, to reason, and to leave it there unresolved. In fact, spirit is the one which is strong enough that it can endure contradiction. But it is spirit again which knows how to resolve it. But nowhere does the so-called world, call it objective, real world, or, in the manner of transcendental idealism, subjective intuition and sense content, determined by the category of the understanding, nowhere, however you call it, does it escape contradiction. But it is not capable of enduring it, and for that reason it is left to the mercy of the coming and ceasing to be. C. The infinity of quantum. The infinite quantum, as infinitely great or infinitely small, is itself in itself the infinite progress. As great or small, it is a quantum, and at the same time, the non-being of quantum. The infinitely great and the infinitely small are, therefore, figurative representations, which, on closer inspection, prove to be unsubstantial, nebulous shadows. In the infinite progress, however, this contradiction is explicitly present, and with it that which constitutes the nature of quantum, which, as intensive magnitude, has attained its reality and is now posited in its existence as it is in its concept. We must now consider this identity. Quantum is as degree simple, self-referred, and determined within it, because the otherness and the determinateness are sublated in it through this simplicity. The determinateness is external to it. It has determinateness outside it. This, its being outside itself, is at first the abstract non-being of quantum in general, the bad infinity. But further on, this non-being is also a magnitude. Quantum continues in its non-being, for it is precisely in its externality that it has its determinateness. And this, its externality, is itself, therefore, equally a quantum. The non-being of quantum, the infinity, is thus limited, that is, this beyond is sublated, is itself determined as a quantum, which, consequently, is its negation is with itself. But this is what quantum, as such, is in itself, for through its externality it is precisely itself. The externality constitutes that in virtue of which quantum is quantum, where it is with itself. In the infinite progress, therefore, the concept of quantum is posited. If we now first look at this progress in abstract determinations as they are displayed before us, what we find in it is the sublating of quantum, but no less also of its beyond. What we find, therefore, is the negation of quantum as well as the negation of this negation. In truth, its truth is the unity of these two negations, in which the negations are but as moments. This unity is the resolution of the contradiction of which the infinite progress is the expression. Its most immediate meaning, therefore, is that of the restoration of the concept of the magnitude, of being an indifferent or external limit. On the subject of the infinite progress as such, the only reflection which is usually made is that each quantum, however great or small, can disappear, that it must be possible to transcend it. Not, however, that this sublating of the quantum, the beyond, the bad infinite itself, also disappears. Even the first sublating, the negation of quality as such, whereby the quantum is posited, is, in itself, the sublation of negation. Quantum is sublated qualitative limit, consequently sublated negation. But it is at the same time only in itself. The sublating is posited as an existence, and its negation is then fixed as the infinite, as the side beyond quantum, while the latter remains on its side as an immediate. Thus, the infinite is determined only as first negation. And it is in this way that it appears in the infinite progress. But there is more to it, as has just been shown. There is negation of negation, or what is infinite is in truth. And this we have just seen with the restoration of the concept of quantum. Such a restoration means, in the first place, that to the existence of the quantum there has accrued a more precise determination. What we now have is quantum determined according to its concept, and this quantum is different from the immediate quantum. Externality is now the opposite of itself, is posited as a moment of magnitude. Quantum, for its part, is posited as having its determinateness in another quantum, through the intermediary of its non-being of infinity. That is, that it is qualitatively what it is. Yet, this comparison of the concept of quantum with its existence belongs more to our reflection, to a relation which is not yet present here. The next determination, rather, which is present here is that quantum has returned to quality, is from now on qualitatively determined. For its defining property, its quality is externality, the indifference of the determinateness. And quantum is now posited rather as being itself in its externality, of referring to itself therein, of being in simple unity with itself, that is, of being qualitatively determined. This qualitative being is still more closely determined, namely, as being for itself. For the very reference which quantum has attained has proceeded from mediation, from the negation of the negation. Quantum no longer has infinity, the being determined for itself, outside it, but in it. The infinite, which in the infinite progress only has the empty meaning of a non-being, of an unattained but sought beyond, is in fact nothing other than quality. Quantum, as indifferent limit, surpasses itself into the infinite, is thereby seeks nothing else than its being determined for itself. The qualitative moment, which, however, is only an ought. Its indifference towards the limit, and hence its lack of a determinateness, which is an existent for itself, its surpassing itself, is that which makes the quantum what it is. This, its surpassing, is to be negated, and quantum is defined in infinity, its absolute determinateness. Quite generally, quantum is sublated quality, but quantum is infinite. It surpasses itself, is the negation of itself. This, its surpassing, is therefore in itself the negation of the negated quality, the restoration of it. And what is posited is that the externality, which seemed to be a beyond, is determined as quantum's own moment. Quantum is thus posited as repelled from itself, and with that there are two quanta, which are, however sublated, only moments of one unity, and this unity is the determinateness of quantum. Quantum, self-referred as indifferent limit and hence qualitatively posited, is the quantitative relation or ratio. In ratio, quantum is external to itself, different from itself. This, its externality, is the reference connecting a quantum to another quantum. Each quantum acquiring value only in this connection with its other, and this reference constitutes the determinateness of the quantum, which is this unity. In this unity, quantum possesses not an indifferent, but a qualitative determination. In this, its externality has turned back into itself. It is in it what it is. And that is going to bring us to the end of this particular section. This remark is rather long. We will catch that on the next one. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I didn't have a whole lot to add, so I know I didn't, right? But here's a good way of looking at this. In philosophy, there is the concept of logos, right? There is the point of beginning, which is all things existent at once in stasis. And then, or that is the source. The beginning is that one point starting to move forward in time, and the logos is every point in time forward. And so the quantum is going to be the source, all the things at once. Even if they aren't differentiated yet, they exist in theory in there, right? The planet has not yet been formed. The beginning is going to be attached probably with the quality, right? It is everything in existence in this snapshot just prior to starting. And then logos is going to be the quantity, right? The everything, every single point from beginning to end is logos. So the quantity is every single moment stacked up over time throughout time. Hopefully that hits the mark well enough. There's not a whole lot for me to add. A lot of this is just arguing about whether being is or being isn't, and we've already done that, right? This is a reiteration in a slightly different way of the exact same things that we were talking about in being and non-being, so there's not a lot for me to add. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment. If you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the comments, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me read or discuss, drop that in the comments as well. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks or even a membership. It will be greatly appreciated. The bills do not pay themselves. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.